Oh,
Okay, so we're going to deal with astrology, and I just looked back to see what we had in the can, and we have this, which was just an introduction. There were some YouTube videos explaining what is astrology, the zodiac and the origins, the houses, the moon signs, the rising signs, birth charts, and how to read a birth chart. So what, if anything, would you like to cover?
Oh,
I suggested the eclipse because the eclipse will be here Monday.
oh, okay. I mean, Nam's Rinpoche was, I was involved in astrology many, many years ago at the beginning. So I had my birth chart done and all kinds of stuff. I was 20 minutes earlier than my brother, so there's changes.
yeah, people can be closer. They call them astro twins that don't have the same parents, because you can be born at exactly the same moment, in
Oh, yeah, right.
two different beds in the same hospital. So you can have closer chart than a related twin. So
Ah,
yeah, that can happen. And apparently, statistically, the lives are quite parallel. So
wow.
interesting. But well, let's see. I don't know where to begin. It's well, this is one of the books that Bart and I had in mind. It was written by two professors, one of whom was at MIT
In the humanities department.
in the humanities. And I forget where the other one was from. It's maybe German, but it's a wonderful book. I think now some of it's been discounted, but it's a look at the idea that all the collective myths, like the body of myths that we learn, I learned them as a child, of particularly like the seven labors of Hercules, or however many they were. I think it was seven. A lot of those contain astronomical data, and the myth was a mnemonic device for remembering the patterns and the cycles. Like a major one is the cycle between Saturn and Jupiter, were father and son. And that's been linked up with the story of, or the story of Hamlet has been linked up with that cycle as well. And that's why the book was called Hamlet's Mill, because that's based on an ancient Danish tale. But there's a lot of
So this thing here, Skalds,
aspect to it.
Skapramo, Icelandic.
Icelandic, okay. It was Danish. Well, of a father and son, and the what's the word for it? I'm at a loss for words. I'm still thinking about the phone call I was just on. The cycle of it's in so many stories. The Parsifal myth, the father reaching his culmination, and then the end of his life, and being supplanted by the son, the son, and just how regular that is in any kind of a lineage of kingship,
Right.
but that's what's being tracked in these stories, that they kept track of things for thousands of years, apparently before writing, and they were watching the mega cycles, not just the annual cycle and the monthly cycle of the moon, of which there are 13 and not 12, but they were tracking this since ancient times. And the cycles of the planets are very, very, very regular. And that's what astrology is really about. It's not so much the signs and the constellations. The constellations have shifted their alignments from when the whole thing was first devised thousands of years ago, because of our axis being so tilted. How many degrees is it again?
It's
20.
23.5 degrees
Okay.
to the ecliptic. And it's inclined to the ecliptic, which is the plane for all the planets that are orbiting the sun.
So the North Pole is describing a circle like this at this 22 roughly a degree angle to the horizon line, which is the
Yeah,
path
but
of the ecliptic.
right, but there's the precession around that axis is 26,000 years.
Right. But that's happening because of this angle. And so then we are pointed at a different North Star just about every 2,000 years. And that means that the sign on the horizon line, it changes every 2,000 years. And that's why we have what we call the age of Aquarius. Why we have these ages is because of that intersection. But there seems to be so much that goes along with it, socially, physically, in every way in our evolution, that somehow keeps pace with the archetypes. And there really seems to be something objective and quantifiable about it. And it goes backwards. We went from the age of Aries backwards to Pisces. And now our kind of current history started in the age of Taurus with the pyramids. And then the age of Aries was the age of monotheism, and that was where in our Western culture, Judaism started with that. And when they talk about reverting to the golden calf, to making sacrifices to the golden calf, when they were wandering in the desert, that was reverting to the previous age. That's why it was such a sacrilege. It was a ram in the age of Aries. So to go back to the bull culture, or the cow, was recidivism to the previous age, and that was part of why it was so taboo. And then the age of Pisces has been the age of, I would say, Christianity and Buddhism, because compassion underlines them both so much. But we have this idea of sacrifice as well. So the signs are sorted into the four major elements. We don't use ether or spirit in Western astrology, but it's fire, earth, air, and water, which are really describing styles of energy. So the water signs are associated with emotional sensitivity, compassion, inwardness, or introversion and depth of feeling. So that's Cancer, which is very nourishing. Scorpio, which Bart is very intense. Pisces, which I am, is very empathic. Those are our sun signs. The fire signs are said to be enthusiastic, warm, energetic, and more often extroverted. That's Aries, Leo, and Sagittarius. But everybody, most people are, that's our sun signs. That's the least of it. That's 1 out of 10 planets. Most of us are a complicated combination. If you add our moon sign and the rising sign, at least those 3 things really need to be taken into account. In some people, for example, Bart, they're all the same, but that's very unusual. So then that makes that person a very pure type. Most of us act more like our rising sign than our sun sign. The rising sign is said to represent the persona with which we present to the world, and it's the first impression that we make. So mine is Taurus, and I have Mars there. So that covers up the Pisces is more shy and retiring, and that's more hidden. I think people see my Mars on the ascendant and think I'm more confident than I necessarily am. So in before modern times, before the telescope, we used 7 classical planets, is what they were called. The sun and the moon are included as planets, and the Earth is discounted because we're on it. So we're looking at everything from the point of view of Earth. Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn made up the known planets, because Saturn is the last planet that you can see with your naked eye for the most part. You know, sometimes under certain conditions, you can see Uranus and occasionally even Neptune, but it depends on their orbits and different things. But for the most part, things ended with Saturn, and Saturn represents limitations, and that's said to be because it's the last planet that's visible to the naked eye, and it has the rings that surround it. So it kind of symbolizes what it is. Jupiter symbolizes largesse. It's the largest planet. And expansion. Saturn's more about contraction. As I said, limitations. So they're talking about the mathematical relationships between the planets are really what we look at. It's their interaction is the main thing, and the style of interaction they're talking about here. 180-degree aspect between the 2 planets is a straight line, and that's known as an opposition. And it often, if it shows up in a birth chart, it oftentimes indicates alternating between the 2 energies. It's not necessarily, superficially you can say it's often antagonistic, but it can also be very complementary. I'm a Taurus rising, and Bart is a Scorpio rising and sun and moon in Scorpio, but that can be very balanced and very complementary, like this, rather than just a tug of war, which it could be, which it might have been if we had gotten together when we were younger. Hopefully we're mature enough now to handle it creatively and spur each other to expand in new directions in a productive way. So it's challenging, but it doesn't have to be a negative challenge. Hopefully my Taurus energy, which is Earth, will help to stabilize Bart's scorpionic energy, which is very intense, but at the same time, his drive will help to get me unstuck, because Taurus can tend to get stuck in routines. And Scorpio has such a drive to transformation. So this is on the right here. I love this diagram because it's showing what I was saying. And now where is this from? Does it say here?
Kepler.
Yeah. But this is ancient, and like who is it? The
Early European books
right. That's showing the
from the
repetition.
Royal Library in Copenhagen. So this is Kepler's.
So it's Jupiter and Saturn, the great conjunction. See how much better my eyes are getting?
Mhm.
That's from 1606. But they find who were the Mayans kept track of things like this. The Egyptians kept track of
And
things.
here's the relationship over here. So it's not something that would jump at you immediately. That here we have the period of Jupiter, which is 4,332 days. So 1 over that minus 1 over the orbital period of Saturn, which is even longer, 10,759 days. That gives you the conjunction period, which is 1 over 7,253 days. So, it makes you wonder, how in the world did they ever notice this?
And there are these tiny little dots, that are moving each at their own rate, but they're at regular intervals. They're conjuncting. They're even though Jupiter is moving so much faster than Saturn. That's like 4 to 10.
This is like every conjunction is every 20 years. Every 20 years, they're seeing this. And who in the world is doing this? And why is it important?
Right. Why would they bother if it didn't mean something to them? But it's called a synodic cycle. So they didn't have computers, to keep track of it. And now it's a lot more research is going into it. But they had to do this. I've talked about this before. They would place a stick on a hill in the distance to, keep track of, these intervals. And when the sun was rising and where exactly it was rising, and then the earth is, rotating this much every day, and it's coming up in a different place in the sky, but they kept track of these things. It's just extraordinary. And so part of their way of doing that was to have these myths with these mnemonic devices of these stories about Jupiter overcoming Saturn. And they decided that Jupiter was the sun overcoming, the Senex figure of the father, as in the story of Hamlet, and all of his anguish and ambivalence, as the guilty son, and the whole thing is Oedipal and blah, 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 and it's, but it was something of enormous importance to them. And they were tracking the great ages, that the Hindus talked about as the great year. they were making these little scratch marks in the dirt and keeping track of it in their heads. They didn't have paper and pencil often. They didn't, much less computers, much less, printers to diagram this all. So it was a very rarefied profession, let's say. It was the shaman that was entrusted with this. And they, you'd be finally really trained just in time to retire and start passing it on to the next one. The knowledge was so in depth. Yeah. So
Well, the way I see it is it's like a system of knowledge that was measurable for a very long time.
right.
So it was much part of the Western understanding that was available that everyone could share. And of course, then they try to use it to the nth degree, I'm sure.
It was, it was required knowledge in every religion. Now they talk about it as being forbidden. It was the priests who knew it. It was the shaman and the priest who knew all of this. The Vatican catacombs are full of this kind of information, and diagrams. Then because they didn't want everybody knowing it, they make it, verboten and taboo. But in Dante's time, it was required study to even at any university, which were run by the churches, and you could major in it, which he clearly had more than passing knowledge. Maybe next week I'll talk about some research I did into the Divine Comedy, and his references in it are incredible. He's actually telling you the chart of a particular Easter weekend. It would have been nice if I had thought of doing this for Easter. But he tells you exactly where everything is from Good Friday through Saturday through Easter Sunday. And with one little, he flips two things, which was an occult kind of practice. They call it a blind. They do that to, fool people. And so I figured out what date he was actually talking about. He was talking about an actual weekend where there was a total eclipse and the equinox at the same time, where the sun and day are equal length, as well as Easter Sunday, which is based on the lunar calendar. It comes out of the Hebrew calendar for the Seder, for Passover. That was the Last Supper, where the story has it where Jesus was kind of sent off, to his mission. So it was his goodbye party. So the positions are astronomy, and they're very, very regular. And as I said, the Mayans could track eclipses more accurately than our computers could do today. Maybe they've just recently caught up with AI. But these people who didn't have AI, they had their own memories and, very simple instruments, except, in like Mesopotamia, they had incredible instruments. I think that's part of what they wanted to destroy. When they were talking about, remember the donkey carts and mass destruction? I think they were really destroying their astrolabes and things like that. But so it was really about the interrelationships between the planets. And the ancients talked about the dark ones or the hidden ones. So I believe they really knew about the three outer planets that we use. And I don't care what you call Pluto. It's still, the 10th rock. from the counting the sun. It's the
Yeah, there's a lot of evidence. There is a 10th planet. We just haven't discovered it.
Well,
It's probably,
there could be another. And,
Yeah.
and there are astrologers who specialize in the asteroids, which apparently was a planet.
yeah.
And another thing that's interesting is that the solar system seems to be have come out of a spiral with the intervals very close to the golden section. It's another ratio. But these things are extremely consistent. And now with the telescopes that we have, we can look at other solar systems where similar things happen of these other, rocks orbiting around a star. They tend to arrange at the same intervals, the same ratio in the spiral. That's like, what I think of as the Fibonacci sequence. That governs everything. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about astrology and astronomy. It's not so much what is referred to as the fixed stars, which are the constellations. It's the moving stars and their relationships and intervals. And as that earlier slide was talking about, there are aspects, ratios of like an opposition is 180 degrees, a square is 90 degrees, or a trine is 120 degrees. And for some reason, I don't claim to understand it. It seems to describe the vibrational pattern, like the harmonics between these moving bodies, in a way that it shows up when scientists transmit radio waves between the planets. The radio waves are disrupted or not disrupted or carried. A trine aspect will carry the wave much more than a square. And astrologers refer to trines as an easy flow aspect, and squares are a challenging flow, which isn't necessarily good or bad. That's another simplistic thing. And Dante was sophisticated enough to know this. He would describe these things as, well, it's challenging, but there's more energy there. If you learn to work with it, you can do more with a square. A trine often makes us lazy. People with a grand trine very often have what we call a charmed life. So that's regardless of their sun sign. But people with, say, a grand cross, which I have, tend to grow more because of the challenges. Gandhi had a grand cross. So, we're always being crucified by things pulling us in different directions. And that makes us, they say, more compassionate and insightful, because we're so used to being drawn and quartered. So I have what's called, Dave Rudger was one of my favorite astrologers when I studied, a scatter chart, which means I have planets in just about every sign and just about every house. So that the blessing was that made me more of a Renaissance person. Even my day job was in publishing. I actually worked a lot of nights, but I was a proofreader, a copy editor. I did layout, I did typesetting, and those were all considered very separate things. Later, I went on to do research and writing, again, two separate things. But when I hand in an essay, I can't help copy editing it myself. So it usually gets published and printed verbatim from what I did, because I've already copy edited it for them. It's like a compulsive thing. I can't help it. But Dane Rudger was amazing. He talked about not only the static aspects, like a 90-degree aspect, but the cycle, again, because they're always moving, it's pretty complicated. And so he described all the relationships in terms of the lunar cycle. So if they were coming toward each other, that's an applying aspect. And if they're moving away from each other, that's a separating aspect. So he would talk about an applying square is building up the quote unquote crisis energy, and the separating square is more of a resolution usually than an approaching. I don't like to use the word crisis because it has such a negative connotation in our culture, but that's often just sort of a climax that forces us to have awareness and take action. And that's what the square usually does, is it gives us an impetus to act, which isn't necessarily a bad thing at all. So
You want to say anything about, this is just recasting Jung's impact, but it also touches on the I Ching and on tarot.
well, I think Jung influenced me, for example, as an astrologer, because it brings together the archetypes and the synchronicity. And he felt those two things were connected. He felt that when we're in the field of an archetype, our synchronicities increase. And that's kind of an effect of the archetype. That may sound completely crazy to some people, but it's definitely what I've seen. And when I want my deepest insight into some situation that I feel overwhelmed by, I go to the I Ching. And I prefer the Wilhelm translation, which Jung was a colleague of Wilhelm's, and he wrote the, I think it was the preface to it.
Yeah.
And so that was seminal for me. And there's just so much wisdom in it. And they're looking at really at the mathematics of the situation. And it's all permutations of a kind of binary code of like a long dash and two dots. It's like Morse code. Dit, dit, da. If you pile up 6 of those, that gives you a hexagram. And that's exactly what we do with our computer code, with the yes and no or on and off binary system in our the foundation of all of our code that's still used today. It's as if the universe was using the same thing in some kind of massive computer, and our DNA, it's just really uncanny. And I went into studying astrology skeptically. I didn't have belief, but I just thought there might be something there. And part of it was that I knew that people like Copernicus, Galileo, and Kepler all honored it. They all studied it. Why would these geniuses take the time to study something if it was just some self-fulfilling prophecy that was just useless? I just couldn't understand why they and Jung would waste a minute on something that was just totally frivolous. And that brought me back again and again as I was learning it. They call it a hermetic science because it's kind of got this, it's like a seal around it, because it's such a different way of thinking from our Western linear, scientific method that's not really what we're using in our everyday culture. It's a very watered down version of it, but it's still what people think, and they think they're being sophisticated and, using their reasoning and their logic. So it's also a very limited way of thinking. for example, DNA strands in our body. What is it? How long is it? If you put them end to end, and
it would be
adult?
over 2 meters long. There's 3 billion base pairs in the 2 strands of DNA inside each of the 50 trillion cells in your body. So it's
that
2
are,
meters.
minuscule. But if you spread them out, how long is our
Our body's 2 meters.
right? So it's the
Right,
length
so
of an
it makes you
average
wonder, how did it get folded up?
right. But then different pairs are next to each other, so they could be more related if they're just folded the right way, rather than
Right.
in the strand, they might be 3 or 4.
It could be hundreds of thousands, millions
Right.
of base pairs away, and yet they're physically
But
they're on top of one another
But if they're
because they folded around.
right, they're right there. And I think that works with the dimensions of the universe and everything. So there were people who'd set out to debunk astrology, who actually ended up coming up with evidence for it, statistically. And I talked about one of them was a man named Michel Gauquelin. He was a French statistician, and he set out to disprove it. And he did show the sun sign stuff definitely is bogus, but that's not what astrologers are talking about. That was something that was created fairly recently just to make money. And I read those less than the average person probably, but that's not at all what we're talking about. So I studied for 3 years before I kept saying, well, I was just going to do it for one, or I'll do it for another. And then I talked myself into doing it for 3. Before I came to the conclusion that it didn't work, I wanted to give it that much of a chance. And I saw enough, questionable evidence to keep going over those 3 years. But I had been a scientific proofreader before that, and I read medical studies cover to cover and proofread them, brain surgery manuals. So I knew how to be logical. Both my parents were physics majors who switched to English. So that was part of the family ethos, was the scientific method. I understood that, but I just thought there's something else going on. That isn't describing everything that's going on. And I thought, I wonder if the ancients knew things that we've forgotten. And that is what I found. So, but you have to understand the complexity of the system to even understand what it's saying enough to say whether you understand it, let alone believe in it. You have to have enough experience. And my first teacher said he didn't want to hear any of the students giving an opinion about any of it until they had looked at least 100 charts. He said, then you'd begin to have some insight into how it might be working or not. And you can start to say whether it's accurate or not. And that usually takes a few years. And that was definitely what I found. One really interesting occurrence in a class was the teacher was bringing in actual people's charts. Famous people's charts is a really good way to learn, without their names being revealed. The names were hidden. And I looked at one. I'm not sure if I'm going to remember. I think it was Venus on the ascendant and Neptune on the midheaven, or either that or the other way around. And there were keywords that were like diaphanous and beauty. And I said, that's Marilyn Monroe. And my teacher said, why do you say that? I said, I don't know. I just see all this, kind of diaphanous feminine energy, and and beauty. There was also a lot of intelligence in it. She was very intelligent. I said, I don't know. I just, the words came into my mind, Marilyn Monroe. And he said, well, we call that the chart speaking to you, because the chart spoke to you. It wasn't anything, logical that I was seeing in it. The chart spoke to me like in a gestalt. And it was her chart. And I had no way of knowing that. I had never seen it. But it just spoke to me as her chart. So as Jung said, it was the first form of psychology, which it's been discovered since people are translating and examining his red book, which is that's my left shoulder there, if you can see it. It's about this thick, with his paintings and writings from his dreams and his thought experiments. And a lot of it was done in trance. He was getting a lot of the fundamental insights that he was working with from astrology, and then learned to do charts for all of his clients. He didn't necessarily discuss it with them, but he looked at it for himself. It's said to be an opposite dynamic to do a chart for a client and to do therapy with a client. So I've always honored that. I haven't done both for the same person, because when you're doing a chart for somebody, the astrologer is doing all the talking and all the explaining and describing. In therapy, the client is unfolding and they're doing their own self-discovery, and the therapist is creating kind of an alchemical vessel for that, a container for the process. And so there's a lot more listening and witnessing and reflecting, and it's a slower and subtler process. Astrology is more of, in psychological terms and therapeutic terms, an intervention, where the astrologer is laying it out. So that would be too invasive to do week after week after week. And that's part of the reason why we don't usually do the same thing and do both things with the same person. And that's why Jung didn't. But he collected them. He had, volumes and volumes of charts of his clients that he consulted. So that's part of what kept me going, to get to the point of seeing 100 charts and to see how it works. It doesn't work in a simplistic, mechanistic way. And it's never going to tell you exactly what's going to happen on Thursday. Anybody who can do that is also psychic, and they're jumping off the chart to extrapolate other information that they're getting from other levels. And I do believe the chart can function that way. It's really kind of like a mandala that if you meditate on it, it can start to speak to you like a, so-called crystal ball, as this mandala that seems to line things up in these harmonic synchronicities. I don't know how else to say it. That if you understand the language, like Mars, for example, Mars rules war, it rules fighting, but it also rules sports, friendly competition. That's a good way to sublimate Mars energy. If you don't want to get into fights with people, do something else competitive. Like running, just and vigorous exercise. That's all ruled by Mars. And Mars can be a lot of things. It can be sex, but it's not ever going to be love. That's Venus. And Venus can be liking, Venus can be beauty, it can be art, attraction, all kinds of things like that, that can be quite impersonal. You know, it's really like magnetic attraction sometimes, that's not necessarily liking or loving. But again, it's never going to be Mars. So the way things express, Venus and Mars together can be extremely creative, and it can be very sexual, and it can be lively because of that square energy. A square will make it very dynamic, but they tend to balance each other as yin and yang. Venus is considered the yin, the passive and magnetic, and Mars is considered to be yang and the initiator. So the two together are really ideal. But if you're dealing with 10 planets for 2 people and looking at their charts, that's a lot of interaction to look at. From they've both got 360 degrees to play with. They don't have to line up exactly in the same spot. They can be 60 degrees, 80 degrees, 90 degrees. Looking at all 10 planets in 2 people's chart is pretty complicated. You know, it takes a few hours to look at it all. And we do have the benefit of computers now. I mentioned him a while ago. Lining it all up so you can kind of have a score sheet, a cheat sheet of the interactions between 2 charts. And that's called synastry, SYNA. So it's a comparison. But we're not just looking for all trines and happy and everything being compatible, because those people usually drift apart, because we need a certain amount of friction to be learning from each other and to grow. So you don't want all friction. You need a certain amount of peace to just sort of, make it through dinner every night without breaking all the dishes. But too much of that can be static and not interesting enough, and people will drift apart. Or if there's too much conflict, people just get tired too. But you can't really say where that's going to be for each person. There are averages, and you can look at the chart somewhat. That can be helpful. Some people are more comfortable with competition and conflict than other people. Other people want it to be all hearts and flowers and getting along all the time. So somewhat of that temperamental preference, some of that will show in the chart, but not necessarily. So it's hard to generalize and predict, but I've had really meaningful conversations with couples, with clients, and I've even helped people break up, which is an important thing, I think, to be able to do it with consciousness and kindness. And something that was really interesting to me was they had both been yoga teachers. They were quite evolved. They were big meditators. The woman's chart was aspected like twice as much by the man's chart as his chart was by hers. So it just didn't do as much for him as it did for her. And he had broken up with her a while ago. They had been married, they got divorced. He did it as kindly as he could. And he was with somebody else. And this woman, who was actually my client first, just did not want to let go of it, because she was just so convinced they were meant to be together, and he was in denial of their destiny. And so I was in the position of saying, but it doesn't click as much for him. It just doesn't touch him in as many places, this relationship, as it does for you. And they both had to acknowledge that was true. It was a really difficult conversation to have, but I think it was really helpful for both of them. And she ended up thanking me, you know, and I really hoped it kind of set him free. I went into it hoping to bring them back together, hoping to make her happy. That was kind of my inclination, because of where she was coming from. But then when I looked at the charts and I saw them in person, he liked her a lot. He had a lot of compassion for her. He wanted to be like sister and brother for life, but he just didn't have the same passion for her that she did for him. That's a really, really difficult situation, but it showed in the charts. And I would have thought, just a kind of instinctual mathematical assumption would have been that they would have had the same number of aspects for each other. You know, that an aspect from his planet would be the same as, you know, reciprocal to an aspect from her chart to a planet in his, but it wasn't. It's totally mathematically possible that her 10 planets could be triggered by his twice as much as hers triggered his. And it was really sad. But you know, that's my training. But that's the one thing that can spell death to a relationship. Other than that, we don't know what makes people tick. We don't know what makes relationships tick. But the one thing is, if it's not ticking, it is, if there's just not enough energy there to maintain it. So we say challenging aspects are much better than no aspects. And some people will thrive on that and be learning all kinds of things that we have no idea about. And that's none of my business. But I felt it was my business to be honest and say, it just doesn't look like there's enough interaction here from her chart to his chart, which they both had to acknowledge. So that was interesting. But it's really, it's it's very challenging. It's real soul work, I found. So this is talking more about the statistical work that was done by the Gokulans. Eventually his wife, speaking of challenging relationships, she joined him in the research and publishing, and then they had a terrible breakup. And I've heard of stories of them, you know, tearing data out of each other's hands. There were all these fanfolds in those days of, you know, computer printouts in the street as they were fighting over, you know, who should keep the original data. Leave it to statisticians to fight over the data. So they're talking about the Mars effect was one of the main planets studied. And when it's at an angle like the ascendant or the midheaven, it seems to have these statistical effects or implications. And mine is on my ascendant, which, you know, we would say, as my first astrology teacher said, well, you're not one to back down from a fight, are you? Because I kept saying, well, I'm not very martial. And I said, no, that's true. I'm not. And it's square my Mercury, which can mean a warrior with words. And so one of the ways that translates is a lot of lawyers have that. And I've had to act as a lawyer reluctantly, the reluctant warrior, for more than 10 years. So I've been using it. So Mars is associated with athletes and policemen. Saturn with scientists because of the precision factor. Moon with writers. I also have a strong moon. And Jupiter with actors and politicians. And if you understand this symbolism, it actually all makes sense. It's not just arbitrary. So the significance level, was very high in this. So tried to argue that he wasn't demonstrating astrology, but some other celestial influence. Well, that's what we call astrology. So he and his wife and a few colleagues actually tried to found a new school that they called cosmobiology rather than astrology because of the association with the sun sign columns, which really are kind of a hoax. So they thought it was that his results were because he was working with charts from France. That wouldn't have any bearing on it. That is ridiculous. So there was a lot of back and forth. So I used to have, a bunch of his books before the tsunami came into my life. And that was part of the training that I received was based in part on this cosmobiology school of thought. And before we met, or when we were first getting together, we discussed that before we met, Bart had a chart in his hand called a 90-degree dial that the school of thought developed to look at more minor aspects in the charts. And it was very scientific and, really looking at like logarithms and harmonics. And Bart had seen one in his hands when in the 80s or
Yeah.
So I had one of those. So the precession of the equinoxes is what causes the changes in the ages. And all these ancient people were aware of this phenomenon. And that's apparently a lot of what preoccupied whoever it was writing so many of the myths. So here he's talking about the great ages in the Hindu cycles, which is the 4th month of world history. But they're talking about major epics, and here they're referring to his book, Liber Novus, is this magnum opus of his that was just published in like 2009, I think. So until then, a lot of his more esoteric interests had been, more or less disguised, unless you were aware enough to pick it up. He wrote about it in just about every book that he ever published, but not overtly. You'd have to know what he was talking about to know what he was saying. So if you didn't know enough astrology, you wouldn't realize that was what he was talking about between the lines. So
Yeah, the reason why it wasn't published was Jung's family thought he'd be looked on as a nut. So they didn't want to have his reputation destroyed.
So rather than look at astrology differently,
Right.
because he took it seriously, they chose to keep it suppressed. I think the age of Aquarius is upon us and very exciting. You know, it's bringing about a different kind of egalitarianism and equality and availability of information and knowledge that just was not accessible. And it's not all, you know, academic knowledge. It's, you know, awareness of what's happening around the world that nowadays the average person could have what we would call a film camera before and transmit some kind of a riot or a revolution happening on the other side of the world, you know, via satellite. And they don't have to be a multimillionaire with access to Hollywood to get it out there. So there's a lot more instant news and awareness. And I think a lot, the dust hasn't settled yet in the transformation, but
the news is instant, but the
right.
you know, interpretation of what's going on is also instant, and that's what's wrong. You need some time to reflect on what in the world is going on here.
And it's also distorted, you know, it's deliberately distorted and just deliberately hidden in the whole, you know, truther thing. But the potential is there. Okay, Ruperty was another good one.
And this Theosophical Society. So here we have.
See, and people ask me, well, do you really believe in it? And I have to say, kind of like Jung said, no, I know. You know, I've seen it in operation enough. And, you know, I guess I could say, let's say, I started at the age of 29, 36 years of looking at it
Yeah.
closely. I've seen it operating enough. I'm not saying I can tell you what's going to happen next Thursday. We wouldn't have any mystery at all if we could do that. I mean, everybody would do it. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying it can be useful. And it can be extremely accurate. And I had a boyfriend at one point who, for some reason, was just extremely attuned to Mercury retrograde, which I think we're going to have starting on Monday. He would know it the first
That's what
day.
the eclipse is.
Right, and the eclipse. He would just know it immediately because, you know, something would go wrong with his car, and then there'd be a miscommunication about picking it up from the mechanic, and then one other thing. And if there were three things in one day, he'd say, oh, Mercury's retrograde, isn't it? And I'd say, I don't know, I have to look. He'd say, you have to look in your book, I just know. And it was true. So I saw that enough times to realize that he could feel something that I couldn't feel. But someday I want to prepare a paper on the double slit experiment and how what that shows jives with the phenomenon of Mercury retrograde. Because we know it's not actually going retrograde, but it does seem to reflect, you know, more chaotic events happening on Earth, but it's not actually retrograde. So that's somehow in relation to the thought form of it apparently moving backwards, which is mysterious if you think about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Why would that affect anything? So he says that that book shows really all of his raw material that he developed into all of his theories. But a lot of his experience was showing him the collective unconscious. I think that's a good way to say it.
Mhm.
That he was using his own psyche as a lens, as kind of a magnifying glass to see it firsthand. But he said you want to have a glass bottom boat when you're doing that, because you can be completely subsumed by the archetypes. They can take over. And that's a pretty good definition of madness.
Which he probably was.
He may have,
Yeah.
had a temporary,
Breakdown.
but he kept functioning. He was still able to, keep his appointments at the clinic, and he also saw clients at his house. He had an office at his house where he saw private clients. He could keep to his schedule. He could show up. He could give classes. So a lot of people can't do that without any psychosis going on. So if he could, it seems like maybe it was a kind of Alan, was it Alan Watts who encouraged people to work with schizophrenics as coaches
I don't know.
to kind of enter into the madness with them and witness it. And they have a week or something in a cabin together and just ride it out with 2 or 3 people taking notes and witnessing it and honoring it as like a dream, as a valid experience that the patient was having. And they would move through it and it would resolve, and they would come out and be able to be far more functional than they had been, and without medication. So they saw it as something that could resolve itself. And it could also be helped with particularly minerals for some reason, like zinc. That zinc can make a huge difference in somebody that we label as schizophrenic. So it's a philosophical question, I think, as well.
Yeah.
Political.
Yeah, we'll put the handout along with the video when we send out the recording. But this is what I was, Jung goes back to Plato, who, of course, had his own opinions. He didn't go with the masses. And that's why people read the dialogues. That's what their power is. But
that went back to Socrates saying, your own mind is an instrument.
Right.
Use it. Believe your mind. So I think Jung was really trying to use his self as an instrument. As an artist does, and scientists do too, but they don't really consciously acknowledge it, and sometimes I think they don't know it. That their data collection is suspect too.
Yeah. I'm skipping ahead here.
Yeah, and I agree with this. I would not, recommend blaming the planetary configurations for life's vicissitudes. Or that fate is simply an external, irrevocable force imposed by the personal celestial order or a god, you know.
Yeah.
It's still how we're interpreting it. It's still how we're experiencing it. It's still what we do with it.
Yeah, the
and-
Germans have this zeitgeist, the spirit of the time,
right.
you know, which is the euphoria where everybody gets caught up with some cockamamie idea, and you know, you just can't go against it. It's just this tsunami of people that are, you know, all caught up with this thing, and you ask yourself, what in the world is going on here? How could all these smart people be caught up with something so ridiculous? But you know, that's what we see on Wall Street all the time. Is, you know, in 2008, we had this incredible crash due to people going out there and monetizing mortgages. And how is it possible to take a batch of mortgages, and some of them are primo mortgages and some of them are absolutely terrible, and you put them all together and the end result is it's all good stuff? That's like impossible. But you know,
Well, the banks end up owning a hell of a lot of houses.
right.
That's what ends up happening.
Yeah. So that was that particular zeitgeist that or you know, at the end of the 1990s, just people got caught up with the internet and with telecom, and of course that was going to be the thing that was going to go crazy, and it did. It just took 20 years. But you know, you end up with people just getting in front of the curve on these things. So I'm just looking here to see. Yeah, this was Jung's perspective. He was talking about a multi-storied house that he saw in a dream while he was still working with Freud. So it was like 1905. And the upper story was furnished in Rococo style. Rococo. Okay. And then the ground floor was much older, maybe from the 1600s, whatever. And then there was a stone stairway that went down to the cellar, which in the cellar was from Roman times. And then when he looked at the floor of the cellar, he noticed a ring, and he could lift up one of the stone slabs, and there was yet another staircase that went into the depths, which had scattered bones and broken pottery, like the remains of a primitive culture. You know, and so this is, you know, classic Jung. He has this image of this, and you just key on, for example, what's on the very top, and you miss out on what it's built on. And that was my first inkling of a collective a priori beneath the personal psyche, and I first took to be the traces of earlier modes of functioning. And so with increasing experience and the basis of more reliable knowledge, I recognize them as forms of instinct or archetypes. So, you know, here you see how Jung, even then, is starting to distance himself from Freud, saying that this is really what's going on here. And Jung shared with the view that Goethe had, let him who fails to learn and mark 3,000 years still stay void of experience in the dark and live from day to day. Goethe was an incredible poet. So this is someone who took the German and pushed it into English to keep the rhyme.
I think it's live from day to day,
Lives.
to say.
Okay. Yeah, the US uses the term bubble. The Germans uses zeitgeist, the spirit of the time. You know, whatever it is, just this madness of crowds, this euphoria that people get caught up in, and then it arises and then it dies out. And you say, how did this ever happen? Anything here you want to touch on?
I did a lot of this kind of thing. When I was a student, we did, we would enact a chart. We in one class we did each other's. It was really powerful.
Sure.
You know, so and the subject, the person whose chart it was, could move around and play different planets and have other people enact the other planets and then the given configuration. And it was very illuminating. You got to
Right.
see the motivation of each planet.
And but the key thing here is you're transforming, you're going through this individuation here to integrate into the consciousness all of these different things to have what Jung called the self that was there. So, you know, this is, you know, it's hard to sit there and just dismiss this and say there's really nothing here. There clearly is a lot of thought that's been given to all of this. And the fact that he goes back to medieval times, you know, is classic Jung. And Plato and so forth. You know, what nature leaves imperfect, the art perfects. So this allows for his preference for the idea of wholeness rather than the idea of perfection. You're never going to achieve this perfection, but you're going to continue to evolve and as a whole. And Jung understood fate in particular as a paradox. So you can't send one's horoscope back and order a new one unless you've got a religious conviction that promises that the new horoscope will be coincident with a new spiritual rebirth. So there was a Christian theologian who did exactly this in the 2nd century, and of course got nowhere. Some astrologers accept the idea that fate is concrete and fixed, and more psychologically inclined astrologers understand fate as multi-leveled and negotiable. Jung's view, the horoscope side of things presents a real conundrum. Ultimately, one must do gladly and freely that which one must do. But those adverbs that are in there, gladly and freely, imply there's a voluntary conscious cooperation with the eternal facts, the archetypes that are influencing all of this stuff. And they can't be coerced or eradicated. And so the free will for Jung involved respect for and acceptance of the will of the demon, while simultaneously,
Daemon,
right?
that's spelled wrong.
Yes, you're right. You're right. While simultaneously encompassing this potential transformation to allow both the personality and the daemon to flower together. So you're evolving here. And
What Jungian astrologers say is that we have the freedom to some extent express the fate on a more or less conscious level. So the more conscious you are, the more you feel like a co-creator, because you're working with the patterns. So you're deciding you want Mars to represent hard work and discipline rather than conflict and competition, let's just say, for example. So you're choosing the level of expression consciously. And the less conscious you are, the more likely you are to be at the receiving end of what's happening. And you just kind of passively go along with it. And then you're going to have more of the quote unquote negative or primitive expressions of the energies. But I also believe it can change outcomes.
Yeah, but probably can't. The I Ching,
Not that you have total control.
no. The I Ching, which Jung viewed as the Eastern equivalent to Western astrology, offers a similar paradoxical perception. The holy sages put themselves in accord with Tao and its power, and in conformity with this laid down the order of what is right. So by thinking through the order of the outer world to the end and exploring the law of their nature to the deepest core, they arrived at an understanding of fate. And of course, if you did all this, you would evolve. You would end up, where your free will took you.
And you see, it's not just a either or. It's an interaction.
And then we have this famous interview that the BBC did with Jung, and he was asked, does he still believe in God? And Jung replied, now? Well, it's difficult to answer. I know. I don't need to believe, I know. And of course, everyone scratched their heads going, he knows God? And who knows what he was thinking,
He wasn't thinking about a man on a throne with
No.
a long white beard,
No.
doling out punishments and rewards. That he definitely was not thinking.
Then we have this progression where we end up with predictive astrology, where astrology is trying to predict or forecast future trends and developments. But today, most astrologers view this as a misnomer. Modern astrology doesn't claim to directly predict future events, but there's a pattern with regard to the future that can correspond to a variety of possibilities. And so what's foretold is the trend of circumstances and the nature of the individual's reaction to the situation. So you're evolving and you're shaped by this, and progressing and transiting movements of the planets indicate phases in the individual's life where the potential shown in the natal chart will be given opportunities for development. Of course, you have to take advantage of those, whether through favorable or unfavorable circumstances, reasoned and sensible life choices. So in short, modern astrologers like Marjorie do not generally predict actual future events, but claim that the future is mapped out and determined. Even the stuff I saw with Nostradamus honestly felt there were, I'll just say, multiple timelines, and they could fan out, they could converge. And you could be in this timeline, and then after a period of time, that timeline merges together with a bunch of other timelines, and so it goes. So even someone like Nostradamus, who was actually looking into the future, he himself would say, I can't predict the future. There's all these different timelines. Even if I picked one, it's going to change. It's going to move. It's going to merge. End of story. And then there's this emphasis on free will. Nothing's written in stone, but you have strengths and weaknesses, talents, opportunities, blind spots. And so no planetary aspect brings a fate that can't be counteracted in some way, and some benefit can be derived from it. So the actual events that happen are largely dependent on the freedom of choice of the individual, and the role of the astrologer is to create the self-knowledge and awareness of the movement of the planets and their meaning, to give the individual improved ability to make reasoned and sensible life choices. And so it goes.
We say our job isn't just to predict the future, but to help you co-create it. That the more conscious you are, the more
right. Marjorie has a tarot deck floating around her someplace. But anyway, what do you want to say about tarot?
I see it as a dialect of astrology. It's not based on the stars, but it's based on the archetypes. And you can kind of see the movements of the archetypes in the stars and the card. And they usually interweave in a kind of an interesting way. But the tarot really comes very directly. It's a Western esoteric tradition. At one point, it was really hidden from view and kind of given to the gypsies to protect. And that's sort of where we think of it as originating, but it really originated in Kabbalah, which a lot of people want to deny. But
here.
There's just too much correspondence in terms of the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. All the overlap of Kabbalah.
It's a different spiritual technology than astrology.
But they will overlap,
Yeah. Yeah, 1300s, 1400s in Western Europe.
It's amazing how consistently codified they were. Whether it was in France or Italy, it was very, very consistent how they were depicted, the 4 suits and the 22 major arcana corresponding to the letters of the Hebrew alphabet.
What do you want to say here about the Book of Kells?
Well, that was an illuminated manuscript by Irish monks. They say that the Irish saved Christianity. That was created and then lost for a long time. I think it was actually rediscovered in Scotland.
Yeah.
But they're amazing images. So here's one that shows the 4 evangelists. And so this is the kind of evidence we have that the church knew it full well, But here's Taurus, the bull. This is Aquarius, the angel. And these correspond to the 4 evangelists. Scorpio is represented by an eagle. That's a long story. It's a resurrected scorpion. And then the final one is a phoenix. And then this is a lion. They didn't really know how to draw lions, having never seen one
In Ireland,
in
yeah.
Ireland. This was like around the year, what, 900 or something like that.
Yeah, well, yeah, 700-800 was when everything was really shutting down, and it really was the Dark Ages.
Right.
And so this was all there was left of what you would say would be civilization in Western Europe, in these monasteries. So,
And then they drew these incredibly intricate, pen and ink designs with all these curlicues, but over and over and over again, you see these 4 signs, and these show up. Again, here's the 4. And here's what they're. So Matthew is associated with the man. Mark is the lion. You see that in Venice, right? Luke is the ox, is Taurus, and John the eagle is Scorpio. And here it is all over 2 different tarot decks. The 4 evangelists are in the 4 corners. They're the 4 fixed signs that are said to kind of anchor what we think of as reality. Here they're intermixed in Crowley's deck, these 4 beasts of the apocalypse. You can see there's the head of the bull and the tail and legs and feet of the lion. Here's the eagle and the legs of the, I don't know what that is, the man. And there's the eagle's legs, and they're all kind of intermixed in this chariot, which represents the Merkaba in Kabbalah, which is our vehicle,
right.
our soul vehicle.
And the only thing we're missing here is there a Hindu version of this? The only thing we have is the the Mahabharata, Bhagavad Gita, but there isn't anything like the I Ching, or like I'm sure it's there someplace in these Hindu manuscripts. I just haven't been able to figure out where it was, but they didn't miss anything. So I'm sure there was something. I'm sure the Buddha had his own tarot deck someplace.
It might have been more like the I Ching, but
right.
There's correspondences, and believe it or not, Aleister Crowley could be extremely scholarly when he wanted to be. And he wrote a book called 777, where he worked out pretty consistently. I'm having an allergic reaction to something. I apologize for rubbing the nose over and over again. But he worked out very intricate correspondences between the various systems, and he has it all charted out. So I have a copy of that book. I've just replaced in the front hall.
Yeah.
But we can all be kind of competitive with each other. And a colleague of mine who's an astrologer said to me once, well, you really can't put it down for any length of time. You have to keep up with it. That's because she knew I had backed off from it for a while. But I kept up with astrology. I mean, with tarot. I just couldn't look at my chart because everything else was completely eclipsed, so to speak, by Pluto transiting my moon. And I just didn't want to look at that over and over again. There was nothing more important than that to see or to say, whereas I felt I got more detail as to what was going on in terms of insight with the tarot. Sometimes you do just have to bear down and make it through and survive something, or learn as much as you can. And but I try to tell people, well, don't just ask when it's going to be over. Ask what you can learn, from the process and in the meantime.
Right.
it was like a 10-year process for Pluto to go across my ninth house. Now it's in my 10th. So I still don't know how that's going to unfold, but it took 10 years to go through my ninth house, which is where my moon was. And I've been getting such a deep initiation into all the ninth house issues are like law and higher education and justice and all kinds of concepts like that. And the moon can represent the mother, and my mother was at the center of what was going on. She was a teacher. She was a very special philosophical kind of person. All that's really strong ninth house stuff. And I became, well acquainted with the dark underbelly of America in a way that I really didn't want to know. But it was an initiation that really couldn't have been avoided, apparently, because I wasn't going to turn my back on my mother and my siblings. So, by the time Bart and I got together, we had both had initiations into this dark underbelly. And that was one of the things that we really had in common. So, I knew how to get online and look up all of his cases in the state of Connecticut and his federal cases and read them cover to cover in the computer system, and come to my conclusion, which was that he was a victim of entrapment. That's my honest conclusion that I came to before I was involved with him. I wanted to understand what was going on before I became involved with him. So it wasn't my prejudice. I thought it was an interesting guy, but we weren't involved yet. When I studied all of that I couldn't have done. Well, I had to have an account to get into the federal court system. You need an account and a password, and there's like a few initiations you have to go through to get into that, and then how to download it all and what to make of it. And then I looked up a lot of statutes about what was involved and what I felt was entrapment. That's a pretty deep thing to have in common. He wasn't having the identical transit, but our charts are kind of opposed. So for him it was a different kind of education, but it was an education for both of us. And so that's an amazing synchronicity to have in common. And we had this common interest in mysticism and meditation. And
the main thing we have in common is that there's never been any notion of justice and ethics and morality in our legal activities. It's always just been each of us dealing with the dark side of things, the absence of goodness. So be it. Anyway, let's call it a night, and we will reconvene next week with yet another saga on what's going on, and we'll talk about the eclipse, hopefully, because we'll have gone through the eclipse on Monday, and the weather's supposed to be good.
A rule of thumb for our listeners at home. In general, we feel that eclipses tend to kind of speed up the film, like old-fashioned, films, so that processes that you think would take 6 months or so just happen all at once overnight. And this can be for better or for worse, and things going on in your life. But it's the guidance generally is try not to initiate too much. Try to just sit back and let go as much as you can. There are people who say that's always a good way to live anyway. But especially now, don't try to initiate too many new actions or try to force outcomes, because there's so many wild cards floating around that things could just kind of boomerang out of control. And so it's better on that particular day, especially, to err on the side of caution and wait and see if you can. Plus we're going into Mercury retrograde at the same time. So that's going to add to even more of that weird kind of boomerang energy. I personally am trying to sit on my hands through this legal situation, and I'm torn in half. On the other hand, I really want to jump into the fray and, try to head off this disaster and that disaster. But what I'm learning over the years of doing this, it's been 14 years now, very often when I do sit back, things do have a way of taking care of themselves that is not my doing. And that's really reassuring, that there's something in life, call it the divine or some kind of divine order or whatever it is, that other factors come into play that are beyond my control, beyond my understanding, beyond my knowledge. But then in retrospect, I see, oh, that couldn't have happened any better if I had planned it, and it was by letting go that it actually happened. So
yeah, so one example of this was there were a lot of back taxes on the house, $81,000 worth of taxes, including penalties. And by doing nothing, they magically got paid. And we stared at each other and said, what? We didn't put up 81,000, but they're all gone. And there was a $300,000 lien. That's gone.
That was removed too.
But
so my deep throat, who's a lawyer in Europe, and he's from Sweden and he's back there now. He predicted all of this, and so I listened to him. I didn't really have any choice. We didn't have the money, and he could see it coming. He used to work for MERS, which is really bizarre. They're the mortgage electronic registration system. I don't want to go on too much into too much detail about it, but he's brilliant, absolutely brilliant, and really enjoys this kind of Robin Hood role that he has of helping us little guys fight back against the system. And he said, don't worry about it, don't panic, don't do anything. He said they're going to have to pay it. They will. He's absolutely right. Absolutely right.
$381,000 gone. So
wow, how nice.
Anyway, let's call it a night.
Well, they're also trying to take the house.
Yeah, no, they haven't.
It's not benevolent.
Yeah, that's just part of the story. Okay, we will catch you next week. Have a good.
Okay.
And good eclipse too. Good eclipse.
Good eclipse.
Yeah. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Hang tight.
Bye.